Jesus' proclamation of a forthcoming theocracy looked to Israel alone. The kingdom of God Jesus proclaimed, Israelite theocracy, had nothing to do with non-Israelites. Think about Gentiles living in Jesus' day, hearing his message. What would they know about or care for an Israelite Messiah? Only ancient biblical Israel and Israelite tradition had a social role of Messiah. And only Israel's tradition had a cosmic figure known as the Son of Man or Skyvault Man, the personified constellation we call Aries, the ram, connected with Israelite theocracy. The theocracy proclaimed by the historical Jesus and his political faction was an exclusively Israelite affair, an exclusively Israelite theocracy. This is explicitly remembered in the gospel called Matthew. The earlier Mark and the later Luke also present this, contextually, if not explicitly. But how can we be sure that the historical Jesus was concerned exclusively with the Israelites of his day and not other peoples? The scholarly criteria of embarrassment, incongruity, multiple attestation, and coherence help us to be reasonably sure that Jesus was in fact this way. Consider the criterion of embarrassment. In the gospel called Matthew, Jesus admits no Samaritans whatsoever. But by the time Luke and Acts were written, apparently, Jesus groups did include Samaritans, recognizing them not as half-breed mongrels, but as true Israelites. This was also true of how the Johannine Jesus group thought of Samaritans. Just read chapter 4. Notice how the problem of admitting non-Israelites was a very big problem in the first century Jesus groups, appears in the writings of Paul, which were all written before the Gospels. We have a whole playlist on this channel about Paul's true perspective on non-Israelites joining the Jesus groups. Without getting into that here, notice that whatever that issue was to him, neither he nor anybody else in his writings quotes Jesus on this score. No one uses Jesus in Paul's writings to justify or tolerate the inclusion of non-Israelites. A long time after Paul, Luke and Acts were composed by an anonymous author. Here, too, no word of Jesus is to be found on this score. Then we have the criterion of incongruity. Note carefully how there are no non-Israelite Jesus group members in the Gospels called Mark, Matthew, or John. These three Gospels reflect communities that were solidly against non-Israelites. But the Johannine Jesus group, disagreeing with the Matthean community, considered Samaritans to be Israelites, but not Judeans. The incongruity surfaces in the book called Acts, where we read about the first true, guaranteed non-Israelite joining the Jesus group. Then we have the criterion of multiple attestation. All synoptic Gospels report Jesus having no theocratic outreach to non-Israelites. Perhaps these Gospels do report that Jesus healed non-Israelites, but that can hardly be proven. For one thing, we know now that there were Israelites, Judean Israelites, who served in the Roman army as centurions. But let's say, for sake of argument, that the centurion mentioned in the Gospels was in fact a Gentile, non-Israelite, and that Jesus actually did heal Gentiles. Well, such healing behavior would hardly be distinctive of Jesus among Israelite holy men. Just look at Elisha. Also, it would not prove or demand that because Jesus did them a favor, he had an active outreach to outsiders to Israel and wanted to include them as insiders in the theocracy. Finally, we have the criterion of coherence. All synoptic gospels report that Jesus' career was oriented toward the Israel of his time, to Jerusalem, to obeying the God of Israel. There's nothing mentioned about a worldwide mission to non-Israelites. The so-called Great Commission, found in the high context passage at the end of the gospel called Matthew, is almost always mistranslated. The Matthean Jesus does not send his apostles to all the peoples, but rather to Israelite emigres living among the peoples. High context, folks. Never trust your English Bible translations. As far as English readers are concerned, there is no plain sense to any Bible passage. Now let's talk about the Son of Man. We can be sure that the historical Jesus spoke about a celestial or astral entity called the Son of Man, or perhaps better, Skyvault Man. Also, we can be sure that the historical Jesus understood that this other-than-human sky being was someone other than himself, and that this cosmic figure would be the harbinger of the Israelite theocracy. How can we know these things surely? Again, scholarly criteria come to help us. First, we have the criterion of embarrassment. Even though the Gospels report Jesus anticipating the arrival of the cosmic Son of Man and his bringing about the theocracy, they were embarrassed that no such celestial figure appeared. They would never have invented Jesus speaking about something guaranteeing it would happen if decades later, in their time, it had failed to do so. Therefore, by this embarrassment, the historical Jesus must have actually believed and proclaimed this. They honored the words of the Master, even though they never came about. Then there is the Criterion of Incongruity. Some gospel passages, when read carefully, show that Jesus understood that the cosmic Son of Man was someone other than himself. But clearly, in the Gospels, there are other passages where Jesus does in fact identify with this Son of Man. These passages were later additions, attempts by the evangelists to reinterpret the risen Jesus as being one and the same with the angelic Skyvault Man. Notice that Paul, in his writings, completely lacks any talk of this Son of Man figure and his relationship to Jesus. Finally, we have the Criterion of Coherence. Jesus often spoke about celestial or astral phenomena. This is especially true of his final discourse in the Synoptics, given in astrological forecast terms. The historical Jesus was quite familiar with Israelite sky lore and its cosmic Son of Man figure. Following Dr. Bruce Molina, Dr. John Pilch, and the rest of the context group of biblical scholars, it is very important to point out that whenever you speak about Jesus and the New Testament, you are not talking about anything Jewish, Christian, or pagan. Those categories, Jew and Jewish, Christian and pagan, are always anachronistic in theology, historical Jesus research, and simple Bible reading. In our modern usage, these words all point to groups and values that post-date Roman Emperor Constantine and the 4th century Common Era. All Jews on planet Earth today trace back to the Talmuds. All Christians on Earth today trace back to Christendom, the political religion of Emperor Constantine and its subsequent ecumenical councils. And the word pagan was coined after Constantine by Roman Christian elites to dishonorably label non-Christians who didn't conform with the new program. So what would be more appropriate designations when discussing New Testament peoples? Context scholars suggest that it would be better that instead of using Jews or Jewish, use Judean or Israelite. Instead of calling New Testament peoples Christians, it would be better to refer to them as Messianists. And instead of calling anything in the New Testament pagan, it would be more appropriate to use the term Gentile or non-Israelite.